The title, From Surplus Value to Surplus Power, communicates the central theme of Chapter 5, which is that the economy, surplus value, and politics, surplus power, are intimately related, forming yet another parallax that Zizek mines in this chapter. This marks the beginning of the third and final section of the book, with the first two sections addressing the parallaxes of reality and philosophy and freedom in science, respectively. Now we consider the parallax of economics and politics. In doing so, the philosophers Heidegger and Badiou figure centrally. One of the consistent critiques Zizek seems to level at both thinkers concerns their approach to finitude and failure to place the economic more centrally in their thought, which becomes problematic for each figure for different reasons. I should note that what I present here as Heidegger and Badiou's thought is only their thought reflected through Zizek's interpretation of them. I have no doubt that such presentations would be highly debated by scholars of both figures. Nonetheless, more important for our consideration here is not how accurate Zizek is in presenting their thought, but the way Zizek's critiques of them yields insights into his own philosophical contributions, paving the way for what is to come in the final chapter. We begin with the thought of Martin Heidegger. One of Heidegger's major contributions is his elaboration of finitude as a fundamental feature of human existence. It portrays us as always in a process of becoming in the context of an excessive reality. Such finitude is the condition of possibility for encountering the world as a horizon that is intelligible and meaningful. Horizons could be likened to perspectives or frameworks out of which we make sense of our experience. Every horizon contains not only what is actually in experience, but also unactualized possibilities, thereby delivering to us a notion of world that is open to what is not yet. Notably, Zizek frames Heidegger's conception of finitude as a reformulation of failure. A failure not opposed to success, but as a matter of success in the sense of heroically assuming our failure to achieve some trans-historical absolute knowledge. In other words, success in Heidegger's thought marks a coming to terms with the limitations of our existence, death, perspectival knowledge, etc., and in so doing, become capable of retrieving unactualized possibilities in the face of our finitude. This finitude seems to extend to the notion of ontological difference, wherein we confront the irreducible gap, a parallax gap, if you will, between being and beings, a difference that Heidegger believes was forgotten in the history of Western thought. Although Zizek seemingly praises some of Heidegger's contributions here, he also identifies at least three problems with it. First, he appears to have fallen into the temptation of seeking to impose an ontic order that aligns with ontological truth. This is exemplified by his suggestion, made in Being and Time, that every particular science, the ontic, must be grounded in a more fundamental ontology. Second, Zizek identifies an internal inconsistency in Heidegger's early thought, pointing to a section of Being and Time in Part 2, wherein Heidegger discusses the shift from individual to communal fate as it relates to the historical happening of Dasein. It is our thrownness into a world that delivers us a collective past from which Dasein can choose a hero and repeat their acts as part of a communally assumed fate. This view, it seems to Zizek, contradicts Heidegger's ideas in the same work concerning individual, resolute, authentic being toward death. There is an illegitimate analogy made by Heidegger between individual death that marks a radical separation from all others and the idea of a communal death as sacrifice, which brings one into a belonging to others. Third, in his approach to social life, Heidegger neglects the role of political economy in its connection to technology. Whereas there is a sense of freedom in the community's capacity to domesticate technology within the political, the economic is displaced, appearing instead as a kind of fate outside the scope of human intervention. In summary, although Zizek does not put it in these terms, at least explicitly, it would seem that all three identified problems are marked by a tendency to collapse the particular into the universal, thereby reversing his move to establish ontological difference. Even the third point, the displacement of the economic, which falls under the ontic, is subsumed under the whims of autonomous capital B being, which unfolds itself in whatever way it pleases, regardless of human intervention. The question is then raised as to whether it's valid to imagine a version of being in time without a turn toward a collective fate, but that resists remaining highly individualistic. Zizek does not think so and identifies what he sees as a structural necessity for the particular passage from individual to collective in being and time. Specifically, Zizek claims that the resoluteness of individual Dasein is a purely formal concept and thus requires to be filled in by a content derived from a communal tradition, a tradition that remains fundamentally conservative and not revolutionary. So, what about the later Heidegger, who supposedly turns away from his previous thinking? That late thinking is marked by the attitude of Gelassenheit, translated as releasement or letting be. It entails a kind of openness and passivity toward beings, allowing them to be what they are without imposing our will and technological control upon them. It also concerns a kind of over to us. However, Zizek claims that the way to interpret this later thought is through a middle period, which conjoins Gelassenheit with another notion seemingly at odds with it, a phrase that is translated as appropriation or the will to event, and which is connected to active resoluteness for Zizek. Despite seemingly at odds with one another, passivity versus activity, Zizek discerns a covert conspiring between them, much in the way as he sees how Zen Buddhism, while promoting passivity, also legitimates the self-disciplined warrior ethic. Similarly, Gelassenheit is a passive ontological disposition that sustains our violent ontic engagements. And from this, we can perhaps see how Zizek attempts to connect the dots between the problematic features of the early Heidegger, the conjoining of seemingly opposing attitudes in his middle phase as the proper hermeneutic for the latter phase, and his political affiliations with Nazism. I should note briefly that there are some difficulties with this interpretation of the will to event, which Zizek seemingly conflates with Heidegger's earlier notion of resoluteness. Will to event or appropriation already marks a major departure from resoluteness, placing greater emphasis on being rather than individual human beings, but also reflecting the more dynamic and reciprocal relationship between the two. As such, it would seem to me to be not completely accurate to say that this phrase brings together the will as the fundamental feature of modern subjectivity and the attitude of Gelassenheit, because the will mentioned here is not principally about human willing, but the willing of being itself. At the same time, this does not necessarily invalidate Zizek's overarching argument here, especially as there remains the failure to account for the economic and his understanding of finitude, which seems to be the main concern Zizek is addressing throughout this chapter. We then shift into a consideration of the relationship between economics and politics, a relationship Heidegger neglected. Zizek thinks this relation in light of our present ideological landscape, wherein he discerns two contrary positions, biopolitics and capitalism. Briefly, practices. Capitalism, in its pure form, entails the lack of state regulation and control and promotes concepts such as private property and wealth accumulation. Today's late capitalism is further marked by a permissiveness and the absence of explicit limits. As such, capitalism would seem to go hand in hand with a certain politics of jouissance, which entails the freedom to express and obtain one's enjoyment and a freedom from those who would attempt to limit it. However, Zizek argues that contemporary society is less about the politics of jouissance as excessive enjoyment and more about its regulation, which leads us back to the realm of biopolitics. Although biopolitics and capitalism move in different directions, one imposes constraints, one marks the liberation from all constraints, they are in fact intimately connected with each other. Today's superego injunction, arising out of capitalism, turns a permitted jouissance into a compulsory jouissance, a capitalist demand to enjoy, but a joy that must be tightly regulated to keep the too muchness of jouissance under control. Zizek links this too muchness with our contemporary obsession with stress, which he thinks names the excessive dimension of life that must be kept under control. As such, we might say that we must enjoy and be free to enjoy, but only in ways deemed healthy and in our best interest. At the same time, it calls for a kind of obscene excess, the capitalist production of waste and accumulation, that supports and sustains normal bourgeois life, and is in contrast to the inherent ontological excess of a jouissance that exists without any presupposed normality. A final consideration of the link between politics and economics is taken up through Zizek's analysis of Badiou's thought. Badiou posits that capitalism creates a worldless ideological constellation, lacking any meaningful cognitive mapping for most people. The challenge of an emancipatory politics for Badiou, then, would be to create a new world with new master signifiers to provide a cognitive mapping in this worldless universe. But how are we to even formulate truth in such a worldless universe? Herein enters Badiou's notion of the politics of prescription, which at first glance claims to bypass a cautious reformism a la Richard Rorty and a messianic politics of the future democracy to come a la Jacques Derrida. A politics of prescription puts forth axioms like equality as starting points rather than distant goals, and rejects gradual change and compromise, advocating instead for direct action based on universal principles. It is the axiomatic element of this politics that distinguishes it from a pragmatic liberalism and the politics of endless revolution. Zizek then asks, how does the politics of prescription relate to Badiou's notion of anti-totalitarian logic of endless deferral? Both this politics of prescription and totalitarianism seem to involve some kind of almost violent imposition of truth. The answer lies in a certain conception of finitude underlying Badiou's thought. Prior to the opposition between being and event, there is a preceding gap in being itself, which is split between the pure multiplicity of beings and their representation in some determinate state of being. The multitude can never be adequately represented in such a state, and as such, an event always occurs at the site of this surplus or remainder that eludes the state's grasp. The politics of prescription emerges out of fidelity to such an event and must navigate the impossibly difficult terrain of adhering to these truth events without having them fully realized in the order of being, wherein they can be turned into the imposition of a violent totalitarian regime. As such, there must always be a resistance to completely naming the unnameable within a truth procedure. A truth procedure being the process by which a truth emerging from an event is unfolded and actualized. And this marks a potential return to what Zizek calls a Kantian finitude, wherein we find the incommensurable gap between a normative regulative ideal, the noumenal truth, otherness. Ironically, since Badiou is critical of Levinas on this point. However, Badiou is cautious to emphasize that this unnameable is not to be essentialized, the capital O, other, of Levinas, the face of God, etc. And instead, it refers to the irrelevant and indifferent excess of multiplicities that is the real. But Zizek notes that this real is made to be in opposition to the subject who forces their projects onto it through fidelity to a truth procedure. Forcing entails how subjects actively engage with the truths of an event, working through its implications and applying them to an existing state of affairs. Because such forcing can lead to a terrorist imposition, Badiou attempts to mitigate this by evoking the unnameable as the limit of a truth procedure, preventing the full actualization of the eventual truth. A second problematic feature of the politics of prescription, according to where formerly equal market exchanges hide the true nature of exploitation. Attempts to enforce more factual equality, such as equal salaries, often lead to new forms of inequality, highlighting the formalistic and insufficiently concrete nature of the concept of equality in this context. The problem for Zizek is not the terror of such impositions, but that an extremist egalitarian politics is a kind of ideological political displacement that fails to address the fundamental economic issues that underlie inequality as such. In a certain sense, like Heidegger, Badiou avoids engaging with the revolutionary potential of the economic sphere, as he considers it part of the order of being without eventual potential. Consequently, he is left with advocating for a pure political organization limited to mobilizing outside the state structure. Zizek claims that the only way past this deadlock in Badiou's thought is by restoring to the economic domain its dignity of truth and potential for events. And this will lead us to the concluding chapter of this work, which we'll cover in the next and final video on the parallax view. If you got something from watching this video and want to support this work, you can like this video, you can share it, and you can subscribe to the channel. If you would like to support it financially, you can do so through the Super Thanks button below. And you can be a regular contributor on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this work on Patreon. I look forward to wrapping up this work in the next video. And so thanks for watching. Until next time, be well.